All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Monday, October 25th of 2021. Thank you for tuning into the stream today. Monday streams are always pretty exciting here because we've got two things to do. We've got the winners of this week's weekly Max Challenge to announce and our giveaway to do, of course, but also open Q&A and answering your guys' questions that have come through after a busy week of DFS, whether it was football or now basketball or what other sports you guys are playing. Any questions you have, we've got some questions to answer today. So we will get through everything. Right before we go ahead and just start jumping in, though, it's going to be a little bit of a slower pace today, a little bit more of a mellow stream. I was sick all weekend, so no office hours on Friday. I was actually out on Friday. I knew I had to get back here and do my Monday stream just because I look forward to these Monday ones so much. But bear with me a little bit today. Voice be a little bit more soft-spoken, maybe a little bit of a slower pace here. Nice, relaxing stream for us. But of course, we will get to everything. We'll do our giveaways, announce our winners, answer all your guys' questions as normal here. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about with this weekly Max Challenge and haven't heard the news yet, let me go ahead and pull this up and we'll talk about this here. We've been doing this all NFL season. We're going to keep it going through the end of the year. Here's all it takes to participate. You wear the SaberSim logo as your avatar on FanDuel or DraftKings. You max out the Pooch Punt or the Mini Max for the Sunday main slate. You send Andy at SaberSim.com a screenshot showing your entries into the contest with your SaberSim avatar, and you get an opportunity to win a bunch of cool stuff. If you win the contest, hasn't happened yet. We've had a lot of people come really close, but if you win the contest, we'll give you extra cash, free SaberSim, and a custom gear. But the top finisher every week also is going to win some tickets to some free contests, a free month of SaberSim, and access to a free roll at the end of the season that we're going to be doing. And then, of course, the really exciting part here and what I think most of the people that tune in here every week on Monday are looking forward to is the giveaway. So for DraftKings, we do 3 random entrants. Get 3 random entrants get free entries into next week's contest. So you get to play the mini max for free next week. And on FanDuel, 10 entrants randomly will get to play the Pooch Punt for free next week. At the moment for FanDuel, we are working out a arrangement with FanDuel. So we're paying out everything as SaberSim credit. So your $7.50 of Pooch Punt entries will be paid out as FanDuel as SaberSim credit at the moment. But long-term working towards getting an arrangement set up with them to actually award the tickets. But for DraftKings, we are doing the tickets. Anyway, get a whole bunch of free stuff basically for playing NFL DFS that you would be playing anyway. So highly recommend checking this out, participating. If you haven't played up to this point in the season, or if you missed a couple weeks, you can always join in for this next upcoming week here. Gosh, what is it? Is it week 8 we're coming up on, or week 8? Yeah, coming up on week 8. That's crazy. You can start playing on week 8. You can play both FanDuel and DraftKings. I know that's another common question. If you've been playing FanDuel or if you've been playing DraftKings, if you can play the other, you can play both. But anyway, let's go ahead and get into this and at least announce our winners here for this week. So starting with DraftKings, 56th overall finish in the Minimax this week was Nopticopter. So congratulations, Nopticopter. You will win. Actually, this needs to be updated. What we are doing now is 2 tickets to the $50 Red Zone, the single entry $50, and the $27 Blind Side. 2 tickets for $77 of total single entry value, a free month of SaberSim, and an entry into that $5,000 free roll at the end of the season. Nopticopter also won week 1 for FanDuel, had the highest scoring finish for week 1 at FanDuel. So congratulations, Nopticopter, running pretty hot here through the first 7 weeks. And on the FanDuel side for this week, with the 14th overall finish in the Pooch Punt, it is Nick Beasy 82. So congratulations, Nick Beasy 82. You've won a $25 SaberSim credit, also a free month of SaberSim, and an entry to a private $1,000 free roll at the end of the season. So congratulations, Nick BZ82 and Nopticopter. It looks like Cody is here. Actually, I just remembered to now actually seeing your name, Cody. I apologize. I think you corrected me that it is actually Canopticopter from week 1. So I apologize for mispronouncing your name again here, Canopticopter. I will remember that on your next win, which I'm sure you'll get next week. So anyway, let's go ahead and jump into now the giveaways. So again, we'll do 3 spins of our trusty wheel of names here on the DraftKings side and 10 spins on the FanDuel side. Let's go ahead and get into this. So we'll do DraftKings first. I have 59 entries here. So 59 people, will pick 3 of them for this week. Boom, 59 entries up here. So again, we'll do 3 spins here. I can't believe week 7 and we're still using this goofy wheelofnames.com spinner, but it has worked out well for us. I've gotten too used to it at this point to do anything different. So 3 spins for free tickets for next week's mini max. And winner number 1. Wow, that was really close. Canopticopter almost won the free tickets as well. Very close. Kev Collin takes it down, though. Congratulations, Kev Collin. T Swift 98 takes down number 2, 150 tickets to next week's mini max. And our third winner for this week is Dice Hawk. Congratulations, Dice Hawk. Along with T Swift 98 and Kev Collin are 3 winners of DraftKings mini max tickets for week 8 this week. We'll go ahead and copy this here so I can just take a note. All of our winners will get an email before the end of the day letting you know that you've won in case you missed this live, of course, but also when to expect your tickets and how to expect your prizes in your account showing up. Oops. Uh-oh. This one doesn't count, guys. I accidentally clicked it. This is cursed. Here, I'm going to close it. I think it's too cursed for me to spin it without seeing who won that. All right. Cool. Let's jump to FanDuel. So we have 62 entrants for FanDuel this week. So we're pulling the lever here 10 times. So you basically got a 1 in 6 shot at free FanDuel tickets here. So pretty positive EV contest here to play. So let's go ahead and pull this here for spin number 1. Let me just make sure I've got 62 and we've got 62. So we're all set. All right. FanDuel number 1. Oh, it's close, right on the edge. The Great DC 203. Congratulations. Number 2. The Daily Big Kahuna. Number 3. Roll right on the edge. S1 Lopes. Coming up on number 4 here. Ooh, Dice Hawk almost got them both. But it is Elusive Smoke. And number 5 coming up here. Cusp Love. And number 6 coming up. I wish you guys could hear the audio. You'll have to just try this out. 34 midway monster wins number 6 here. You guys will have to just sometime pull up wheelofnames.com and just put some random stuff in here and spin it so you could hear the celebration. It's pretty hilarious. There's people like yelling in the background too. It's good stuff. But anyway, that was number 6 here. We've got 4 more winners for this week for FanDuel. Chao Zhang. Congratulations. 3 more coming up. Will cut 72. And our 9th winner is JCD 78. And our last winner for FanDuel for week 7 of the weekly max challenge is BWeezy 82. All right. Congratulations to our 10 winners here. The Great DC 203, Daily Big Kahuna, S1 Lopes, Elusive Smoke, Cusp Love, 34 Midway Monster, Chao Zhang, Will Cut 72, JCD 78, and BWeezy 82. You guys will all win $7.50 of SaberSim credit to pay for your Pooch Punt entries into week 8. So let me go ahead and record these. Cool. Got those down. So again, guys, still a lot of time left in the NFL season, still a lot of time to win. The whole point of this contest, this giveaway, whatever you want to call it, is inspired by using strong contest selection and bankroll management principles to be successful over the marathon of the NFL DFS season, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint. Practicing good principles of bankroll management and contest selection over the course of a whole season, and you are rewarded for it. So play again next week. Keep entering this. Keep getting the opportunity to win some prizes, win some cool stuff here, and looking forward to doing another giveaway next week, next Monday. Congratulations again to our 2 highest scorers this week and also our 13 giveaway winners. We will now go ahead here and jump into the open Q&A section of the show here. I know I've got a handful more viewers here than I did when I started. So in case you guys missed it here, am getting over just being a little bit sick this weekend. So be patient with me here. I'll probably take a little bit of a slower pace answering some of these questions here, but we will get to everything. So if you've got questions for me, go ahead and pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack or the YouTube chat, and I'll be answering questions here in about the order that they come in, about chronological order. But let's go ahead and start getting into it here. It is suddenly feels like we're right in the middle of basketball season. I know it just started last week here, but 9-game slate tonight. We've also got Monday Night Football showdown. Obviously cooling off and reviewing our NFL Sunday main slate. So probably some great NFL questions will be coming in here today as well. Let me go ahead and just get things started here. So cool. Let me go ahead first and pick up this question. This one came in through support over the weekend. One sec here. All right, perfect. Cool. So this question came in from Kyle here. And actually it looks like this came in last week. So he said, quick question regarding the opening slate for NBA tonight. Obviously, with a 2-game slate, total ownership is going to be higher compared to an 11-game slate. That being said, what should we target for maximum ownership tonight? Or what is too high for a 2-game slate? And this is a really good question. This kind of question comes in often. And I think this is really getting at what is imprecise or inaccurate of using things like an ownership sum total to deal with the complicated problem of ownership in DFS, right? Ownership sums are going to be very different for different sizes of slates. They are also going to be very different for different slate contexts, right? If there is a lot of really great value on the slate, a lot of times the total ownership sum of viable lineups is going to be higher because the field is going to recognize those values. They're going to play those players more. They are still very good plays, and really great lineups are going to have higher ownership sums. It's also contest specific, right? Ownership in two ways, really. Ownership spreads out a little bit more on 150 maxes, large field stuff, than it does on single entry, smaller field stuff. So you may see that smaller, lower ownership sum lineups are more viable in the large field contests, but also because ownership is condensing in smaller fields and single entry contests, you don't need as much ownership leverage to build a lineup that is a lot more unique than what's in the field, right? A higher ownership sum lineup may be more effective. So how do you process all this, right? How do you put this together into a useful strategy that deals with different slate sizes, different contest sizes, different slate context, all together, while also accounting for how fast news changes in the NBA, right? You could be prepared with an ownership sum that makes sense at an hour before lock, and then the slate gets turned on its head 15 minutes before lock, and now how do you adjust, right? This is basically why I don't actually really like looking at ownership sum for almost any sport, but especially NBA. And I think our approach to ownership via our ownership fade slider is much better. And what ownership fade is doing here is it is comparing the player's projected ownership, which is in this column, to the average ownership of the position, right? So the average overall ownership of that player's position, to get an idea of, are they owned more or less than average, but also comparing that player's variance, so what their range of outcomes looks like in our simulations, to determine essentially if they are good or bad chalk. If we think that that player is higher owned than the average at that position, and they are a highly variant player, then we are more likely to fade them when we build each lineup, depending on how high your ownership fade slider is, right? The higher your ownership fade slider is, the more likely we are to fade that player. So what this does is this allows you to make, well, let me start here. This slider has been back tested and set at the value it is at for the specific slate size you are playing, for, of course, the sport and the site you are playing on, but also for the specific contest you tell us you're playing. So we will deal with ownership differently if you tell us you're playing a 500-person single entry versus a 150 max over 50,000 entries, right? In general, for NBA, ownership fade is going to be a little bit lower. We're not as concerned about aggressively fading ownership. A lot of times the ownership on certain players are on the best overall plays on the slate. So it's going to be lower compared to other sports, but it's still non-zero when you start to get up to these higher values. And this is going to build you lineups here that will have a variety of different ownership sums, but they are lineups where that ownership fade calculation has been made on each individual player in the lineup, and we are making basically the decision by handing you that lineup, saying that this lineup has upside for the contest you're playing, whether it is a little bit higher owned in total or a little bit lower owned in total. It has the upside that you need to win this contest overall. So you can see here, right, we'll get some lineups here that have a variety of different ownership sums: 129, 113, 157, 141, 156, 131, right? A ownership sum cap wouldn't be able to deal with the nuance of each individual player and the slate all together very well. Now, with all of that, if you are interested in overall seeing what is like a baseline ownership sum for this particular slate look like, I think the easiest way to do that would be to see how much ownership are people going to get to their cash lineups. So one thing I do like to look at is I will run a build with the cash settings where all of the sliders go to 0, right? We're just going to pick up the best overall average projected lineups possible, not caring about ownership or correlation or the sim variance or anything like that. And we can run a handful of lineups. And I sometimes just kind of like to look at how much ownership are we kind of sacrificing here, or how much lower ownership are we getting in our GPP builds versus what people are getting in cash. And this is really where you can see on smaller slates, you're going to see a bigger discrepancy between the cash lineups and the GPP lineups than you are on bigger slates. But even here on a bigger slate, you can kind of see it, right? So we're getting like 173% ownership, 171, 156. This one's a little bit lower, 169, 166, 151. So again, a little bit lower, 153. But those like top optimals that people are going to be playing in cash, for example, for tonight, looks like probably maybe going to hover around 175 percentage points of projected ownership at the moment. So when we jump back to our build here, we can see that the ownership fade slider that was set at 2 for this hypothetical build of 20 max over 50,000 entries is getting us, it's sacrificing. Well, this one is actually a little bit higher, but, sacrificing anywhere from 60 to 20 to 60 percentage points of total ownership sum, depending on which lineup you take, to get us a little bit of that additional upside overall. So it's an interesting way to just kind of compare, what is the total ownership of a lineup that I'm building for a GPP versus a cash type lineup, the top overall projected optimal for NBA here. But again, in general, I think the ownership sum calculation doesn't really deal with the nuance of the contest you're playing, the slate you're playing, the slate size you're playing, even the particular sport or site you're playing on. So I think it's mostly just interesting as a way to kind of check against. I wouldn't have the approach of saying I'm going to cap all lineups over a certain ownership percentage or anything like that, and instead allow the ownership fade slider to do most of that heavy lifting for you when you enter your contest details in. So, Kyle, I will get you a recording to this particular section of our stream here today, so you can watch this back. And if you have any other questions for me about that, just let me know. Happy to dive back into this a little bit more. So, cool. It looks like this question is pretty similar, so I'm going to tackle this real quick here. This came from Brandon here. He said, how do you change ownership percentages before you build? So this my own column is your ownership projections, and this is an editable column. So if you're looking at this and making adjustments and you think, I think Giannis is going to be a bit more owned than 18%, you can adjust this up to 25, for example, give you this nice color indicator to make sure that you can see that you've changed it. Green means you've increased it. Red means you've decreased it. Maybe you look at somebody like, I don't know, maybe Harden's a decent example. If people are going to play a little bit more Giannis at the high end of price, maybe they're going to play a little less Harden. Maybe these guys come in around the same ownership. You can make these adjustments here. We will use your updated numbers here. I know that is a question that comes in sometimes. People say, if I update ownership projection, will you actually use these numbers? The answer is yes. When we build, we'll use the numbers that are in the my own column. So, but great question. Cool. I'm going to cover some of these other questions that have come in earlier this morning here, and tackle these here. These are some questions that have come in Slack. This one was from Adam here. And long question here. We'll go ahead and read this. He said, first of all, sorry if this or similar has been covered. I've missed a lot of the NBA stuff. Could you discuss strategy idea for slider settings on late swap? Trying to think of strategies that would adjust lineups, not just to incorporate new info, but do so in a way that meshes what happened in earlier games. For example, let's say I took a couple contrarian stances in the earlier games and they smashed, then would it make sense to late swap using less aggressive or even very low ownership fade / randomness? And of course, the opposite if lineups were chalky and if they failed or / middling. Thanks as always, hoping to catch up on the great content. So really good question. And this is a concept that we actually talked about in quite a bit of detail in our strategy session for NFL late swap. I think this is a little bit more of a common concept in NFL, just because you have this one very binary late swap opportunity in an NFL slate where it's relatively easy to look at your lineups and determine after 8 NFL games are over or very close to over, if your lineups are in a good spot or if they're in a bad spot, and how you want to deal with maybe the remaining 3 or 4 games on the slate from there, right? If your lineups are doing really well and are at the top, and especially if you've had low owned plays in those lineups already pay off, you may be able to get a little chalkier, get overall a little bit higher projection in your players playing in the late games, and give yourself the greatest percent chance at a very high scoring lineup. And vice versa, the opposite is true as well. If your lineups have failed early in the early games, especially if they have had a lot of chalky players, you may need to get very different in those late games to have a chance to min cash or something like that, right? I think that can be a way to add a lot of value to your NFL late swap process. And I think it works for NBA as well. I think there are a couple of reasons why it's a little trickier. The first is that because NBA doesn't really have this one binary late swap opportunity, you really need to pick your spots. Like if we look at tonight's slate, let me go ahead and put this into compact view so we can just see all the games, right? We've got I'm Mountain Time. So of course the slate locks 2 games start. There's a late swap opportunity with the 5:30 games, another at the 6 o'clock games, the 7, and then there's one 8:30 game. I think there is, it's a slate specific thing, right? The 5 o'clock and the 5:30 games are not going to be far enough along, even by this 6 o'clock late swap opportunity here, that I think you could really make an educated decision about how your lineups are performing to do this. By about the 7 o'clock games, I think these 5 o'clock by the 7 o'clock game, the 5 o'clock game and the 5:30 games are probably going to be far enough along that you're going to have an idea of how those lineups are performing. And maybe by this point, I think you could justify implementing some of this. So if you have a set of lineups, or most of your lineups are doing very well and you're in a pretty good spot right before these last 2 games, I think it could make some sense. You could justify bringing down your ownership fade slider, maybe your sim variance slider a little bit overall, and late swap into those just higher overall projected plays. I think also where this can be very interesting is if really significant news does break, right? We even saw it a little bit this weekend in NFL with Waller getting ruled out. Waller getting ruled out made a lot of the other Raiders pass catchers very good values. It also made Foster Moreau an extremely good value, who ended up then going to pay off that significantly. When that kind of news breaks, especially if you're playing contests where you're going to be against softer opponents that are less likely to late swap, so you're playing a lot of contests under $3, or you're playing really big contests with a lot of effective entrants, just playing softer opponents in general that aren't going to late swap, I think it can make some sense to turn some of these sliders down just a notch to say, just give me some of the best plays that have now opened up as a result of news breaking. So let's say, let's put together an example and say you've built your lineups, you got your lineups in at lock, you late swapped because some starting lineups came out for the 5:30 games and you didn't touch anything, but you just did a normal late swap. And then the lineups came out for the 6 o'clock games and you late swapped if you needed to, right? And then let's say now we're 15 minutes before the 7 o'clock game starts, and the Nuggets come out and say that maybe Michael Porter Jr. is going to rest. I was going to say Jokic, but Jokic basically never sits games. Maybe Michael Porter Jr. is going to rest, and he's got knee soreness or something like that, right? And that's pretty significant news. That would impact this game pretty significantly. And maybe you're playing a lot of contests under $3. Again, you're playing these softer contests. You know that the field's not really going to late swap very much at all. And what is now really the optimal way to play is, let's say your lineups are also performing very well. I think in that particular case, you can definitely justify ticking down these sliders a little bit to say, just give me a little bit more of the best plays. Let me put these back to the defaults. Give me a little bit more of the best plays, even if you just bring these down by 1 each or 2 each is even an option. A little bit more of the best plays, still rely on the sim data, but I want to late swap and just take advantage of the value that has opened up. I think that's definitely a sound strategy. And maybe let's take the opposite approach and say that your lineups are just doing really bad. You've through 1, 2, 3, 4, 7 games. Through 7 games, you're really struggling here. I think it can make some sense to say, I need to create a little bit of min cash equity here for my lineup. So I'm going to turn up ownership fade. I'm going to fade ownership a little more heavily and let's shoot for some upside here. I need some plays in the late games to really go off to win, to get my lineups back into the cash line. I think that's really sharp. I think that's a great strategy. The only things I would caution you of overall is that in NBA, because there's all these different late swap times, this is something that I would wait until closer to the end of the night to start thinking about and doing, because you're just not going to have a sense of where your lineups are overall early in the slate. And what I would be concerned about is somebody late swapping and aggressively turning up their ownership fade slider or something like that 30 minutes after the first game start, purely because their players had a bad first quarter, right? That happens all the time. That doesn't mean your lineups are sunk. So I would caution you and generally say that this is a better strategy for later in the slate, but I think it's pretty sharp overall. Cool. I'm going to keep rolling here. Keep tackling. I'm going to tackle a few of these other questions that came in through Slack. First of all, Brandon did say that I don't have a my owned column. This question definitely comes up pretty often, or this comment. This table icon will let you control all of the columns you have in your step one. Typically, it just means that you have one of these got accidentally unchecked. So maybe you don't. Maybe this is unchecked, right? Now you don't have my own. You can go and check that back in, apply, and it shows back up. So. Cool. All right. I'm going to bounce over here to YouTube chat, get some of these questions that have come in live here first, actually. So Irvin said, when filling entries, is it best to use ranked or unique fill settings? One of these is not better than the others. They're really just different. So let me go ahead and get some entries in here. I think I'm registered for this slate already. I guess I would say this. I would recommend for the average player, if you are playing less than 150 or less lineups overall across all of your entries, it probably makes sense to just use unique fill. That's going to smooth out your variance. That's going to give you the greatest number of unique lineups overall, give you the greatest % chance of winning any of the contests you're playing that night, right? Rank is going to put the best overall. So if we rank filled my set of lineups that we have right here, so if I take that set of 20 lineups and rank fill it, it's going to put the same first. The first overall lineup is going to go into all of my single entries. It's going to be the first lineup into my 3 max, and it's going to be the first lineup into both 20 maxes, right? And then the next 2 lineups are going to go into the 3 entry max and both 20 maxes, and then both 20 maxes are going to have the remaining then best 17 lineups. So I'm very much doubling down on my highest SaberScore lineups. But I don't really, with just playing like 47 lineups, I'm playing like $50 of volume tonight, right? I'm not really trying to win every contest I'm playing, right? I'm pretty much happy if I were to take down any of these. So I'd rather fill these with my unique fill method, smooth out my variance. Let's go back. Let's make this 47 lineups. I'd rather smooth out my variance a little bit, give myself 47%, or not, I don't know what I'm talking about. Give myself 47 chances to take down any of these contests here and play it that way. At a certain point, though, right, if you're playing a ton of volume, it doesn't make sense to do that anymore. If you've maxed out 2 different 150 max contests and you're also playing 6 different 20 maxes and 30 single entries, and maybe you've got 500 total unique entries, at that point, you can ask yourself, does it make sense for me to actually be building 500 unique lineups, or should I double down on some of the best SaberScore, the best lineups in my pool? I think that's when it starts to make sense to use rank. The other reason why you might want to use rank instead of unique is if you get to the point with your contest selection where I'm essentially neutral about which of these contests I win, right? Obviously, I would love to win the contest that has the bigger prize pools, because they're going to be a bigger payout to first. But I'm not exactly going to be, upset if I bink the quarter jukebox, because that's where the best lineup landed. But if you were playing significantly different buy-in amounts, and your lowest buy-in was maybe a 25-cent contest, but your highest buy-in was a $150 single entry or something like that, then maybe you're not as willing to just leave it up to pure variance where your best lineup ends up. And you might want to use something like the rank fill to make sure that the highest SaberScore lineup is the first lineup into every contest you're playing. But Irvin, let me know if that helps. If you have any other follow-up questions there, happy to talk a little bit more in detail about those. DJ Sirius said, new to DFS and understand projections. I have my core plays with power forward, center, forward, left to fill. With my 15K left, what is your process to find the best projection / correlation for those remaining spots? That's interesting. So, personally, this isn't really my approach to building my lineups overall. But what I would recommend overall, if you have a core, I think core plays are very popular in DFS in general. What I'd recommend doing here is running a build where there's two ways to do this. If you are totally settled on your core plays and you have decided like these are the guys I'm playing, I would lock them in. So maybe you say you've got power forward, center, and forward left to fill. So I'm just going to assume maybe you've locked in Harden. I'm going to just pick some guys. Maybe you like Terrence Mann, who's a big value play. Maybe you like OG, right? So you could go through and lock these players in. Power forward, center. So you've played maybe you've got a guard. Maybe it's LaMelo, who's been hot, right? So maybe you've got these guys, right? So you've got 4 players locked. From there, you can then just go ahead and run a build that matches the overall contest that you are playing, right? So maybe you're playing 20 max right here. And we'll build the best 500 lineups that we can find around the players that you've locked in already. So every lineup's going to have these 4 guys that you've locked in. We're going to build the best 500 remaining around them. And if this is a single entry contest that you're playing, I'm not really sure if this is single entry or a multi-entry, right? But if this is a single entry, you can go ahead and just pick what your favorite remaining lineup is around the players that you've already locked in, right? So you can literally just kind of go through here and eye test these lineups basically and see what is your favorite based on, who's in the lineup, what the ownership sum is, what the projections of certain players look like. This is a really good way to do this. Another approach to doing this that I think is a little bit more flexible is by running what we call a test build. And a test build would be instead just letting the builder, not putting any restrictions on the builder, not locking any players in, and just running the build at default settings and kind of seeing what you get out of this. So if you ultimately arrive at the conclusion that you still want to lock the same players into your lineups, great. You should still probably be able to do that. Or worst case, you can go back to step 1 and just run another build and do that anyway. But this is going to allow you a way of kind of seeing what does SaberSim's model think about these plays, and does SaberSim want to play all these guys? So for example, right, looking back at this, right, we can see immediately SaberSim likes Harden and Terrence Mann quite a bit. Those were 2 of our locks. LaMelo Ball is not showing up at all. So maybe, that's an indication. Maybe there's some bias there, right? LaMelo Ball's been balling out, right? No pun intended, obviously here. But maybe at his price, the Sims think that he's not so much of a good play. So maybe in this particular case, you decide to go with, I'm still going to lock Harden. I'm still going to lock Mann. But I don't see Ball here. And I can't remember who the other guy was that we had said we had locked in, but maybe now we're approaching it this way. And we're going to allow a little bit more flexibility into the rest of the players in our lineups. So that's how I would do it if you were approaching this from overall having like a set of core plays that you had already kind of decided that you wanted to play. I would say that the most flexible option to doing this is to not put any restrictions on the builder, let the build run, see what you get out of it, and then lock players in here in step 3, allow SaberSim to be this kind of advisor role to you a little bit and check some of your assumptions of what you've already decided you wanted to do. The other option would be just starting in step 1, saying, I've already done my research, I'm locking in these players, and I am building the best lineups I can around them. This approach overall is a little bit risky. I would just say that as well, especially if you're going to lock in all but 3 spots here in your lineup, right? You are playing a very condensed pool of players, an extremely condensed pool of players, and your swings are going to be very drastic, right? There are going to be nights where you completely lose because your core's off. And when your core's right, you're going to give yourself a really great shot at building a high upside lineup because your core was on. You have 5 players that all hit, and you are just rotating the remaining 3 around other players, right? You're going to have a lot of upside there, but it is a risky approach. So that's the only thing I would caution you on there. But Going to bounce back to Slack here and answer a couple of these other questions that came in Slack here. So this one was from Tyler, and he said, is there any strategy or best practice for positions to use in the NBA utility spots? For example, not playing a shooting guard in the util spot because they are less likely, big generalization here, to accumulate assists or rebounds and get the double-double bonus, or just let the optimizer do its thing since projections already factor this in. Yeah, so the sims and the sim data is basically going to kind of make sure you're using a player with upside in their utility spots for all sports. And I think there are a ton of big rules of thumb, especially in sports like NFL, that are just straight up wrong about this, that have shown up everywhere throughout the industry. In NFL, the thing you hear always is, first of all, never play a double tight end lineup, which I think is just wrong. Those lineups can have upside. But even now you're hearing only play a wide receiver in your utility spot. Which again, I think is wrong, right? It depends on how the rest of the lineup fits together. How are the players correlated? What does each player's individual upside look like? What is the ownership of the players? How unique is the lineup, right? It's another thing that people don't often consider, is how unique are double tight end lineups in NFL. In NBA, some of those other factors of correlation and our attempt to fade ownership overall in NBA is a little bit lower. But I don't think there's any reason you need to emphasize one particular position or another in these utility spots. Overall, we are going to be making sure that the lineups that you've built have high upside overall, and include a player in utility that makes sense for the lineup. So you'll see commonly, at least it seems like relatively commonly, it's a little bit more of these bigs here and point guards that show up in these lineups, which does kind of make sense. Point guards and bigs are the guys that maybe do have a little bit of a greater chance of maybe getting that bonus, or at least putting up a more diverse stat line, getting blocks or steals, or other kinds of stats that are more likely to score additional points rather than just like scoring. The bigger determining factor, I think, and the more like valuable thing that is going to happen automatically with SaberSim with your utility spot is just having that last player in that is playing in the game locked into that utility, right? Giving yourself the greatest late swap flexibility as possible. I think that's a way bigger edge that you give yourself rather than trying to pigeonhole a particular position into your late swap spot, right? I guess what I'm saying overall is the value you get out of having a player in the utility spot playing in the latest game in your lineup overall, giving yourself the most late swap flexibility overall, is greater than any possible edge you get of forcing a particular player that plays a particular position into your lineup at that spot. So, but really good question there. Andrew said, pretty sure double tight end lineup won the mini max or the $1 or $3.20 max. Yeah, on I think it was FanDuel. One of the best overall scoring lineups was also double tight end. So, and it was really flexible this week too, because people late swapped Foster Moreau in a lot, and it made made a lot of sense to play some double tight end this week. So. Let me jump back here real quick. DJ Sirius said, followed your steps, but I still cannot find the remaining correlation. For example, on a 10-game slate, say the average points to cash is 300. The optimizer may come back with 280. How do I find that plus 20? Yeah, so on GPPs, right, we're not necessarily so concerned about what's happening on the average outcome, right? I would say, well, maybe I'm making an assumption. I'm assuming you're talking about GPPs here. If you're talking about cash games, it's a different conversation overall. For GPPs, our goal is upside. So we're not so much concerned about this projected score here, right? If we just wanted the highest overall projected score like we do in cash games, we would set the sliders to cash, and we would just build the best overall projected lineups we can. Yeah, okay, so he said for GPPs. Yeah, so for GPPs, we're going to sacrifice points of average projected score to build lineups that have overall lower ownership, higher individual player upside and higher correlation on the lineup. So even if average min cash on a particular GPP slate might be 300 points, we are willing to sacrifice some overall projected points to build a lineup with upside because it's lower owned, has higher variance overall, and has higher correlation, right? So that's not necessarily a bad thing. Our goal for these lineups is not to maximize projected score. We want to maximize upside. So let me know if that helps. Happy to dive into this a little bit more here as well. But I'm going to jump into some questions, a few other questions here first. Quick one here from Elusive Smoke. He said, is weather factored into the Sims? Wondering how many tweaks I should make to build inclement weather lineups like we saw last night during the showdown slate. Yeah, weather is factored in here. So for NFL here tonight, let's see. I was looking for something now. I can't find it. Short answer is yes. Weather is factored into the Sims. I know in particular for baseball, in a sport that is very easily impacted by weather and wind, I think can have very predictable results on baseball games, especially in particular parks. I know weather is factored in here in NFL as well. I think weather is a little bit less predictive in NFL overall, in terms of, high wind games. I think wind is probably still the most predictive thing overall in terms of seeing the outcome of that. And that those kinds of things are taken into account in our model. But I guess what I'm trying to say is I would caution overall thinking that necessarily precipitation means the game is going to be lower scoring or that it's going to emphasize the run game. I think those are in general like kind of rules of thumbs that aren't actually overall very accurate or consistent or predictive. I think games can end up being pretty high scoring overall in football, even in big snow games, right? When we get to that part of the year. But we do take it into account already. So I think overall, weather creates uncertainty. Weather creates kind of an element of randomness and chaos to the game. If you want to take a stance, that the weather is going to be like particularly extreme in a game, I think that can be interesting. I think you could also take the opposite approach and maybe say that the weather is being overrated, right? You're kind of trying to basically, rather than trying to predict the outcome, trying to maximize the return when a certain outcome happens here, right? But overall, we do take into account the weather automatically. So we know that this game's going to be windy, rainy, whatever it is. You don't need to go in here and then start tweaking things just at a baseline to account for the weather. I think it's interesting to zig where the field is going to zag and take a particular extreme or approach to the weather overall. Like if I was looking at this game personally, I think it would be more interesting to play this from the standpoint of weather is going to have less of an effect than the field thinks, and what if this game is higher scoring than people think, right? Like that's just game theory kind of minded. That's what I think is interesting about this game overall. But either way, I think is interesting. So, but again, short answer is yes. The weather of these games is already taken into account in the model. So, cool. All right. Taking a moment to breathe here, getting excited here, talking about some of these questions here today, but want to make sure that I'm still catching my breath all right here. Ryan said, NBA Yahoo question. Since the entry editor doesn't support Yahoo yet, it's really hard to MME, especially for NBA with all the news. Do you think just playing cash and a few GPP lineups in the big contests usually has the lowest management fee or has a negative fee is a good strategy? Yeah, I'm going to be honest, Ryan. I think it is almost impossible to play NBA on Yahoo at the moment with SaberSim. I know that sucks. I am as excited as you are to get the entry editor ready for Yahoo. It's something that we're working on. But I think you're asking for trouble. I know they've been running these contests that are like, let me see if I can find it. Hang on. They've been running these contests that are everybody wins, that are like literally everybody doubles their money at a baseline. Do they have one tonight? No, they don't. So they've been having these contests where it's like a 50-cent single entry, but everybody wins. Like everybody doubles, and then it's like a negative 5,000% management fee or something like that. Those are fine because like they're literally free money. But I haven't been playing Yahoo NBA just because I know I can't late swap. And if you've watched the videos that I put out all last week, you know that I think the single biggest edge in NBA DFS is late swap. So I'm not going to play somewhere where I can't really safely late swap at the moment. I played NFL there this weekend, and then ended up in a kind of a bit of a pickle with the Waller news, and just had to do like a global Waller swap and couldn't really get the Foster Moreau exposure I wanted, the Josh Jacobs exposure I wanted. So we're working on getting this set up as quickly as possible on our end to have late swap for Yahoo. But at the moment, I think it's a little bit difficult to play there, just to be completely upfront. So a couple comments on the weather thing. Movie Hood said, bad weather, I play defense. Yeah, and I think like that's definitely what the intuition says. But I'll probably have to do a little bit more research on it. I just don't think that outcome actually happens as often as people think. But I think Kevin Roth, who is the Roto Grinders weatherman, has some stuff on this where like it's actually, there's an impact to the deep ball, the deep passes and long kicks in particularly windy games when the wind is over like 20 miles per hour. But otherwise, like precipitation in particular has less of an impact on the ability of offenses to be successful than people think, right? I mean, while yes, the ball is harder to catch, right? That's probably the biggest thing, or harder to hold on to. It's also very hard for the defense to stay on guys, right? And the offense knows where they're going. So you see like blown coverages and terrible defense all the time in high precipitation games. And I think that factor gets a little bit overlooked. So Don said sometimes last night, I assume this is sometimes, last night the ball was so slippery that it looked like they were playing hot potato out there. That was predictive rain. Yeah. And, that's probably true too. So just difficult to say. I think my personal take is that I think the field assumes that these weather games are going to have the same impact all the time. And in reality, there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of chaos, a lot of randomness when you have these high precipitation games in particular, not high wind games, but high precipitation games, where it really just makes the game state less certain rather than making the game just guaranteed to be a lower scoring, more defensive game, anything like that. So cool. Let me see. I'm going to jump back up here. A few other questions that have come in here in the past half hour or so. Rob said bankroll management. Is it 5% per slate or 5% overall per day? For main slates, for slates with multiple, for classic slates with multiple games on it, right? It should be 5% total across any slates that share games. So put a very simple way, 5% overall per day is better than 5% per slate, right? 5% per slate is going to be a ton of investment over the course of an evening. And your results of those individual slates are going to be correlated because they share games, and you're going to have a very high risk of ruin there. So 5% overall per day is a good baseline. It is really more, if you wanted to play multiple slates, 5% overall for a set of correlated slates, for a set of slates that share games, is what I would do. So I feel like I said that in a very confusing way for no reason at all. 5% overall per day is a much better approach than 5% per slate. So cool. Mike said, when I make lineups for higher stakes, single entry or 3 max, I tend to sort by projected score. Should I be sorting by SaberScore? Also, how many points from the highest score would stay within? Okay, so for NBA, you're not going to see a big difference here. Overall projected score is very highly correlated for highly correlated with upside because players are generally pretty normally distributed, right? Have a very bell curve type graph. So a player's average outcome is going to be predictive of what their ceiling looks like. You can make an assumption of what a player's upside looks like that is relatively accurate in NBA compared to what their average points looks like. So the net impact of that is that changing these two is going to have some impact on your exposures and your lineups, but you're not a dramatic impact on your overall lineups. In a sport like baseball, where the average projection is not very descriptive of that, or not very predictive of that player's individual upside, changing between these two can have a huge change on what your overall exposures look like. So I would say this. I don't think there's anything wrong with sorting by projected score, right? I think you probably give yourself a little bit more min cash equity, maybe a little bit lower upside in your lineups overall. But all you're doing is sorting your pool of lineups that we've already built that we feel are viable for the contest, right? So really what's happened here is we've picked this build and we ran it for a 20 max for 10,000 to 50,000 entrants. And SaberSim said, these are my favorite 500 lineup, or these are the best 500 lineups you can play. And when we sort by SaberScore, we say, okay, give me the 20 with the highest overall upside. SaberScore is quantifying upside by looking at correlation, ownership, and the actual simulation data, right? Sorting by projected score is basically saying, like, what are the lineups that stand to do the best on average, right? The average outcome. So it's really just two different sides of the coin. And again, neither is going to be, I would say, wrong because it's coming from the pool of lineups that were built for the contest. One maximizes your overall upside and one maximizes your overall average outcome. The best overall lineups performing at the average. So that's the way I would think about it. Gun to my head, make a decision. I would always say choose SaberScore because SaberScore is going to be optimized for upside. The SaberScore is going to be dependent on the sliders that you chose for the contest, right? So it will emphasize ownership, correlation, upside, things like that differently based on the contest you told us you're playing. And I think it's probably going to have better ROI over the long term. But it also, of course, depends, if you're already taking very risky stances, maybe if you're already taking a big stand on a certain player or a big fade or something like that, it can make sense to sort by projected score instead, because you don't need to necessarily maximize upside at that point. You've already made a really big stand in maybe your player pool or something like that. But for the average player, the average use case of SaberSim, I would say sort by SaberScore. So Pop said, hi, Jordan, if I play a high stakes contest with max 48 entries, how would you pick that contest on SaberSim? Under 20 max or 150 max? It's a good question. I would say, I'd probably just pick in between in that particular case. So for 20 max, let's say, actually, I don't know how many players are in this, but if it's high stakes, I'm going to assume it's 48 entries, high stakes. I'm going to assume that's probably about here, between 1,000 and 10,000 people. Just my gut. So we see at 20 max, it's 215, and at 150 max, it's 217. So a very easy thing to do would be to just play in between and go 216, and then set this to 48 lineups, right? That's probably what I would recommend. In general, if you're playing contests that are in between the slider settings, I just like to look at what the two closest are around there and pick something in between. So. Cool. Andrew said, Jay, please don't miss my question from Sunday in Slack Office Hours channel. Seems like you maybe have. Let me double check. Okay. Yeah, I did. My fault. And DJ Sirius, I see you had a follow-up here as well. I'll go ahead and get back to that as well. We'll get to everything today. I promise. Okay, so let's grab this. Looking for advice on what you would do when your research build and actual build have polar opposite decisions. In NBA last week, I had Curry as 1% optimal and then got 40% exposure to him in my actual build And then Sunday at NFL, I had AJ Brown at 5% optimal and then got 25% exposure to him. Not sure which signals to trust at that point. I'm less concerned about how they end up doing. Yeah, this is tricky. So real quick, I always like to start when there's questions about research builds. I like to kind of explain to people that maybe don't know what we're talking about, what these are. So the idea of a research build is taking the builder and using it as a research tool instead of just a lineup building tool. And the way we recommend doing that, or one of the ways we recommend doing that, is turning the impacts of correlation and ownership fade off and turning sim variance all the way to 10, and then running 1,500 lineups, which is the maximum amount of lineups you can run in a single build. And when sim variance is at 10, we're going to take a single game simulation of every game on the slate and build a lineup, build the optimal lineup for that set of game sims, and then do it again. And then do it again. And we're basically going to get an opportunity to see what 1,500 different random simulations of how the slate could actually play out might look like. And when we look at our exposures to certain players in this build, we can essentially use that as an approximation of how likely that player is to show up in the optimal lineup. If we compare that number to the player's projected ownership overall, we can make a determination if the field is over-owning a player relative to their chance to be optimal in the slate, right? And there's a few obvious limitations to this, right? First of all, 1,500 is a lot of different sims of how the slate could play out, but it is by no means every particular sim, right? And second, just because a player's percent chance of being optimal is not necessarily how often you actually want to roster that player in a lineup, right? A player doesn't necessarily need to be the optimal play at their position to be profitable to play in a lineup. And the smaller the contest, the less overall you even need to get to the optimal lineup, period, right? But overall, this is the idea. So we could look at this and quickly get an idea of maybe where some leverage plays are one direction or another, right? Maybe plays like Michael Porter Jr., Jaden McDaniels, D'Angelo Russell are looking like plays that maybe are going to go over-owned, and plays like Reggie Jackson or Nickeil Alexander-Walker or Brandon Ingram are plays that are maybe going to go under-owned. And where this question is really getting at, and where these questions, like where the difficulty, or I don't even want to say difficulty, where this gets really interesting is on these plays that are going to be some of the highest owned plays on the slate, that are also some of the plays that are the most exposed in our research build, but have negative leverage overall. James Harden is a perfect example, right? This is a play that theoretically you could think the field is going to be over-owning James Harden, but he's also the highest overall individual player likely to be in the optimal lineup, right? And that's where these situations like Andrew describes here in this question are going to kind of start to show up in particular, is where there are plays that, yes, they are good plays overall, but they're going to be over-owned. And what do you do about that? I don't think there is like a one-size-fits-all piece of advice here, to be completely honest, Andrew. I think there's a few things... There's a few things I would think about overall. The first is I would think about this as a little bit through the lens of uncertainty of your ownership projections, right? And take this as an opportunity to maybe study your ownership projections or look around, right? If James Harden is 40% owned instead of 33% owned, it makes the fade more and more profitable. If he is 30% or 28% owned, it makes the fade of him less and less profitable. And it's always important to remember that there is uncertainty here in both this ownership projection, right, and also this exposure. So I think that's one particular spot. I guess I am framing this whole conversation knowing that the builder wants to give you a ton of Harden tonight, right? Even though this is a player that theoretically the research build says has negative leverage, right? So I would say that's one opportunity, is to think about this like from the lens of looking at the ownership projection and maybe making a decision on each individual player on ownership. Another way of doing this, I think, is going from the standpoint of your stakes that you're playing, right? If you're playing lower stakes, I'm less likely to fade some of these players that are just showing up a ton in research builds and maybe your actual builds as well, because I don't think the field is going to find those plays as readily. And I think there's just less value overall in fading. Maybe this will help me find a little bit more focus here. Andrew said, do you listen more towards the actual build or the research build signals? At the end of the day, if I had to choose between one or the other, I'm more likely to lean towards the actual build signals. The reason why is because those are the lineups that have basically been optimized to play in a certain contest, right? So, if you're getting a ton of a player that the research build makes you think you should be underweight on, SaberSim, as your advisor in that particular sense, is basically saying, like, yes, given this player's ownership and how often their upside shows up in the sims, these are still the most profitable lineups you can play, right? And sometimes that's because those players, like the AJ Brown situation, right? 5% optimal, but it's maybe he's correlated with Ryan Tannehill and Travis Kelce, who have their own individual percent chances to be optimal, and ownership percentages, and the lineup fits, right? So if you're getting a ton of him, it's still just the builder is saying these are still just the most profitable lineups you can play in the contest. So in general, if I'm torn between having to make a decision between listening to the signals I'm getting from my research build or my actual build, I will lean on the side of the actual build. And the other thing too, and one of the things I see people sometimes maybe get a little bit tripped up on these research builds, is you don't need every single edge, right? You don't need to find the optimal leverage on every single player on the slate. This can be a very useful way to like find a angle that you're taking on the slate overall. And it could come in a lot of different ways, and it doesn't need to be for every single player, right? So maybe your angle is like, one thing that's interesting here that just like jumped out to me is like, clearly, at least at this point, the builder thinks that maybe the field is going to undervalue the pace of the Pelicans game overall, or like the scoring potential of these Pelicans players. Maybe your angle for this slate, maybe that's the lesson you got out of this, right? But you don't necessarily need to then go and agonize over what you are going to do with every other individual player here, right? How am I going to play? How am I going to deal with Harden and Wagner and Brogdon and all these other guys, right? So hopefully that helps. This is a really wide open question. So a lot of different ways to take this. If you have any like kind of more follow-up too, I'm happy to dive back in here as well. But it's a really, really big question overall there. A lot of different ways to take that. And at the end of the day, like the most difficult decisions to make about how you want to deal with certain players are going to be these types of players. It is going to be players that when you run your research build show up as some of the highest ownership overall players and the highest exposure players when their ownership is higher than their exposure, right? Because these are going to be the plays we know when we run builds tonight, we're going to get a ton of Harden and Tatum and Wagner in them, even though these players, well, apart from Tatum, look like they're going to be maybe a little bit overowned given their exposure. So the last note on this, I know Andrew said, thank you, I'm good for now. The last note on this I'll say, is that it depends a little bit on the sport as well. I am more likely to just ride with the chalk on NBA because it's lower variance. The chalk is a lot of times better than I am on baseball. Like if I had to just flip a coin and say, am I going to be over or under on this guy that SaberSim likes, but is also going to be really owned in baseball, I'll fade him. In basketball, I'll probably play him. In football, kind of in the middle. Depends on the position. So anyway. Okay, cool. Let's keep it going. I think there are just a few more questions that had come in here. I know I'm coming back to DJ Sirius here in a minute. So, okay. So let's see if we can get this one here. DJ Sirius said, so I'll explain it this way. I see in every winning lineup a low-owned, low-price player that was projected for, say, 10 points, but he scored 20. What was the process to figure out this type of leverage? Yeah. Okay. So I completely agree, right? So part of what we are trying to do in GPPs is, well, actually entirely what we are trying to do in GPPs is build for upside. And there's basically three main things that we are looking at to try to accomplish that. And SaberSim is basically built to account for those primary three things. And they are correlation, ownership, and variance, right? So when you are playing a cash game and you are just trying to build the best overall projected lineup possible, right? We just saw it with our build settings here. We turn all of those factors off, right? And we build lineups. Let's actually just do this real quick, right? And we are going to build lineups. So say we're building cash game lineups that are just trying to maximize the average outcome of the lineup overall, right? We build lineups that have a projected score of, say, 287-ish at the high end, right? About 287. When we build lineups for GPPs, we are seeking upside. And when we start to turn these sliders on, right, we are turning the impact of correlation up, right? So we want players that succeed well together to maximize the overall percent chance of our lineup having a very high upside event, right? We want lineups that fade ownership somewhat in a way that is appropriate for the contest and the sport that we've picked, right? Because a player that is 1% owned, that has a 50-point scoring output, has much more relative value than a player that is 50% owned that scores 50 points, right? So we want to value ownership fade. We want to start considering what the actual variance of a player's range of outcomes looks like, right? We're not concerned with what just the average looks like. We're concerned with what their ceiling looks like and what percentage of the time they get there. That's what our sim variance slider does. So when we build lineups for GPPs, we'll let this build run, but what we are going to see is that we are sacrificing projected points overall. We are having lower average projected lineups to have lineups that are lower owned, more correlated, and have higher upside, right? So in basketball, in a lower variance sport, these sacrifices of projected points aren't going to be very high, right? A lot of these lineups are actually still very close to the average overall projection, but we are sacrificing small amounts of projected points, 3, 4, 5, 6, different points, to have lineups that are lower owned, have higher upside, and are more correlated. So back to this question here, right? When you see winning lineups that have some low owned, low priced player that was projected for 10 points and he scored 20, right? That is probably what that person that made that lineup was thinking, right? Let's look at right here at the start, right? James Harden costs $9,500 salary. His projection is 52 and a quarter. And Giannis costs $10,400 and costs $10,400 and is projected for 50.66. You get 5.5 fantasy points per dollar for James Harden and 4.87 fantasy points per dollar for Giannis Antetokounmpo. If you optimized purely for projected points, you would never get a lineup with Giannis in it, right? But there are clearly going to be a ton of different game outcomes where Giannis outscores James Harden, right? And you may potentially have a lineup that has greater overall upside or greater overall winning potential, win equity in the contest by taking Giannis, considering those players' ranges of outcomes, what their ownership in the contest actually looks like, and so on. That's what SaberSim is essentially attempting to automate or make easier for you. We help quantify the impacts of correlation, ownership fade, and variance on finding upside in GPPs, and also tell you how much to weight those factors. That's what's happening when we're using SaberSim to build GPP lineups. So hopefully that kind of helps. It is a different approach. It is a fundamentally different approach to building lineups than what you have probably seen from any other lineup optimizer out there before. So I definitely recognize why it might be a little bit confusing. Let me know if you're still here, DJ Sirius, and if that was a little bit more helpful of trying to kind of talk through this. So. Trevor said, so say I put in min exposure for cap at 25%. Oh, okay, let's assume we're talking about a NFL showdown here. So say I put in min exposure for captain at 25%, but maybe I want it less in flex for 20%. Does the sim prioritize one or the other? Sorry if this is a dumb question. These should be totally separate. So you should be able to say, like, I want 25% Kamara captain, but only 20% minimum exposure to Kamara in flex, and just be able to do these things totally separate. These two players have completely different player IDs, so you can do this, right? From the standpoint of DraftKings and from SaberSim's standpoint, right? Alvin Kamara captain and Alvin Kamara flex are completely different players. So you can set your min exposures both pre or post build as you please, differently for captain and flex, and it should work totally fine. So. DJ Sirius said still here, but not really. Sorry, I think I'm probably failing to explain this in a helpful way, which is unfortunate. Yeah. Trying to think about maybe a better way to kind of wrap around to my point here. I'm trying to make about seeking upside, right? Okay, here, maybe this will help. So yesterday, the winning points total in one NBA contest was 357. No matter what I changed or ran, the best output I got was 297. Yeah, so, I mean, if you're back testing a particular slate, you're not always going to just be able to build the winning lineup with the tools you have here, right? If you want to just guarantee that you build the winning lineup for a slate that already passed, you are going to pretty much have to take the actual scoring outcome that any player had and load them in as projections, right? And all you're going to learn from that really is how to optimize for the slate that took place yesterday, right? So overall, right, we are trying to kind of create lineups with win equity, with probability of winning in the contest. And to do that, we want to build. So just can't figure out how someone can come up with a difference. Yeah, so like, let's look at this, right? This might be a helpful way of doing it. So if we run another quick build here, we'll run this on default settings. So we have percentiles on the site here. And up here in the top right, these percentiles are basically a tool of visualizing how many points each player and the lineup scores overall at different probabilities, right? So the 95th percentile, for example, is going to be what happens in a lineup when every single player scores the amount of points they only hit 5% of the time, right? And you can see in this particular case, that lineup scores 406 points, right? If every single player hits the point that they score only 5% of the time or less, right? 85th percentile outcome would be 358, right? So in this particular case, right? I mean, again, yesterday was a different slate, but let's say again that tonight, for example, right, that maybe the winning score is 358 points. If every single player has their 85th percentile outcome, that outcome that is 15%, that has a 15% chance of happening for every single player in the lineup, this lineup gets there, right? But this lineup on average, right, if we go back to average, is only going to score probably Oh, here. Dumb DraftKings message here. The lineup on average is only going to score 280 something points, right? The average slate. And there's going to be 50% of the time it's even going to score less than that. But there is that outcome that happens literally, what is it? It's 15% times 8. 1.2% of the time that it gets there, that it scores the 350%, 358 points overall, right? That's kind of what upside looks like, really, I guess. So I'm happy to keep kind of going back and forth here. Keep asking any questions you have, DJ Sirius. Happy to talk through this. I'm going to keep bouncing through and getting to these other questions here. And get to these. So Pop said, Jordan, I run my sim right before lock and enter my lineup, but how much does the sim change after the 8 p.m. and 10 p.m. games? Not sure if you understand my question. It depends on what changes, right? So in general, there's a lot that can change after lock in NBA, which is why I think late swap is the single greatest edge you have in NBA DFS. I put out a video on Thursday of last week that literally is titled "Late Swap is the biggest edge in NBA DFS in 2021." And that's why, right? Teams are not going to put out their starting lineups before 30 minutes before their game starts, sometimes less. And if you don't know who the starting lineup is, you don't know who's getting the minutes, you don't know what the projections look like. So in general, a lot can change, right? Looking at the slate tonight, you'll set your lineups at 5, right? You'll lock everything in. Maybe you know the starting lineups of the 5:30 games if you're lucky. You probably don't know all of them. Probably won't know all the starting lineups of the 6 o'clock game. You might, but maybe we won't. But we almost certainly won't have the starting lineups for these late 2 games. And is there a chance that the starting lineups are exactly as we predict? Definitely is, right? We get the exact Cavs lineup we expect, the exact Nuggets lineup we expect, the exact Blazers and Clippers lineups we expect. There's also a very good chance that we don't, right? Clippers might say Paul George is resting tonight, right? If Paul George rests in the last game of the slate, this has an insane impact on the entire rest of the Clippers lineup, and the projections would change dramatically. And the sims that would run after that are going to be very different, and you probably need to late swap. So, but if the lineup is exactly what we expect, then maybe we don't need to. Then maybe it's not a huge edge that we get. So let me know if that helps. But in general, right, the reason why late swap provides so much of an edge in NBA is because news changes often for every single game. It breaks late. And the impact of a player that is starting that wasn't expected to start, or a player that's sitting that was expected to play, is huge. So Clay said, when I'm doing builds, I've always used default setting for slider. My correlation bar never adjusts. Are you talking about NBA here? I think those are just the defaults. The correlation, okay, so it changes here. So correlation jumps up slightly to moderate with a single entry, 1,000 to 10,000. But it just so happens that in our back testing, the optimal value for the correlation slider for a lot of different contests is 2. So I don't think it's a bug. I think it's just what it is. Correlation factors in NBA are a lot smaller between the players themselves, right? The factors are a lot smaller, but also how much we actually value that information is a lot lower than something like baseball. So it's just a lot lower of a factor for basketball. Brian said, on the CSV download file are the DK standard deviations, FanDuel standard deviations, Yahoo standard deviations, that player's standard deviations from the projections in their sims. Yes, that is correct. That is exactly what they are. DJ Sirius said here, do you guys offer one-on-one coaching for an additional cost? We don't at the moment, unfortunately. But DJ Sirius, I do this show every single day at 2 p.m. Eastern. We are probably about getting to the point here where we will wrap up this one for today, but I will be right back here again tomorrow, same time, same place, every single day this week. So the best thing I can recommend is just come watch this show every day. Ask any questions you have, right? I'm always happy to answer and talk through this stuff for about as long as we can through the hour to hour and a half that this show normally takes. And I think that would be the easiest way to get you up to speed as quickly as possible. In the meantime, if you're interested, we have a ton of videos on our YouTube channel here that you can dive into. So if you want to watch some of these past office hours, they're all up here as recordings. But some of our more like recorded content that we've put out here, we call those strategy sessions. So particular strategy sessions about sports, different contest types, things like that. For the conversations we've been having a lot today, I'd recommend watching this one, the 4 keys to beating NBA DFS in 2021. I think this might maybe give a little bit more of a detailed, this is like an hour and 10-minute long video. It'll give a little bit more of a detailed background maybe on why, like how to be successful in NBA DFS and why we want lineups with upside. And if you watch this video, for example, and then maybe come back to tomorrow's office hours with any specific questions about something that we mentioned in the video that didn't make sense or a question that you have, I think you'll get ramped up really quickly. But again, no necessarily one-on-one coaching, but I essentially am willing to provide like one-on-one type kind of coaching here live every single day, Monday through Friday on this office hour stream. So, but for today, for now, I'm going to leave it there. I don't see any other questions that have come through in my queue. So thank you to everybody that tuned in to this here today. Again, congratulations to all of our weekly Max Challenge winners and giveaway winners. I'll get an email out to you guys all before the end of the day. Thank you to everybody that asked questions and participated here. And we will be right back here again tomorrow. So in the meantime, see ya.